We live as if life were eternal until it confronts us. Pain shows up, the emptiness quiets us, and then we ask, why? Dostoevsky didn't run from those questions. He dove into them. And today, we're going to follow his steps deep into the labyrinth of the human soul, in search of what he called the secret of existence. For Dostoevsky, suffering isn't a roadblock to existence. It's the very path through which we discover the deepest truths about ourselves. It's a narrow, lonely, and sometimes unbearable road, but it leads straight to the heart of the human soul. In his works, every character suffers. In fact, the more intense the suffering, the closer the character gets to some kind of inner revelation, a truth you don't learn from books or moral speeches, but only through the depths of pain. For Dostoevsky, suffering is a harsh teacher, but a fair one. It wounds, but it also reveals. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov believes he can commit murder and justify it with logic, almost scientific reasoning. He sees himself as a superior being, someone who can cross the line of common morality for a greater good. But right after the crime, he begins to fall apart, not physically, but spiritually. Fever, delirium, despair, and isolation are the cost of breaking with his own conscience. And through this suffering, he sees himself, not as the Superman he imagined, but as a fragile, divided, confused, human being. Dostoevsky doesn't write about suffering to romanticize it. He shows it raw, uncomfortable, real. It's the pain of someone who's lost everything, who's been humiliated, who lives with guilt or feels completely out of place in the world. But there's more. In the middle of that pain, he always shows a spark, a glimpse of possibility, of truth, of redemption. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan, the intellectual and skeptic brother, challenges the idea of a just God by pointing to the suffering of innocent children. He can't accept a world where pain exists before guilt. But his younger brother Alyosha offers a different view. Faith as a silent response to suffering, not a denial of it, but a loving acceptance. For Alyosha, suffering is where love can become absolute, where forgiveness can bloom, even when there's no rational explanation. Dostoevsky himself went through extreme suffering. He was sentenced to death, taken to a firing squad, and at the very last moment, his sentence was changed. He then spent years in a Siberian labor camp. There, among criminals and murderers, he discovered something essential: that a human being is more than what we see on the outside. Even in the most degraded man, there's hidden dignity. That experience changed his vision forever. From that point on, he didn't write just to criticize the world. He wrote to dive deep into the human soul. And that's where he found truth. That truth is painful, and maybe that's why so many avoid it. We live in a society that craves anesthesia, comfort, and distraction. But for Dostoevsky, avoiding pain also means avoiding yourself. Suffering is the only cause of consciousness, he writes in Notes from Underground. Without suffering, we don't wake up. A life of only comfort keeps us asleep. You have to break the image you have of yourself, break your false certainties, break the mask. But why does suffering reveal so much? Because it forces us to look inward. When life is going smoothly, we stay on the surface. But when we suffer, we're pushed to dive deep. And in that dive, we find parts of ourselves we never touched before. Fears, guilt, regrets, hidden desires, and sometimes even faith. Faith, by the way, is a word that shows up often in Dostoevsky's work, but it's not automatic, inherited faith. It's a faith born in despair and darkness, a faith that's only real because it's been tested. Many of his characters, like Sonia in Crime and Punishment, embody this kind of humble, suffering, yet powerful faith. Sonia, a young woman forced into prostitution to support her family, is the opposite of Raskolnikov. She doesn't try to justify her actions with theories. She simply loves, forgives, and suffers in silence. And it's she who leads Raskolnikov back to life. Not with logic, but with compassion. Dostoevsky seems to be saying that there's no transformation without pain, that we learn to stand only after we fall. That suffering, far from being something to avoid at all costs, can be the fertile ground where the soul begins to grow. Suffering is part of wide consciousness and a deep heart, he wrote. It's not a mistake in life. It's part of what makes us human. And there's something almost rebellious in that idea, because in a world that constantly tells us to avoid pain, to ignore it, to numb it with meds or distractions, Dostoevsky invites us to go through it, not as masochism, but as truth, as maturity, as purification. He doesn't promise that suffering brings answers, but he does say it can help us ask the right questions. It can pull us out of autopilot. It can wake us up. And you? Have you ever experienced a moment when pain revealed something about yourself that you would have never seen otherwise? Share it in the comments. Your story might reach someone who really needs it right now. You're free to do whatever you want, but are you ready to face the consequences? That's the question Dostoevsky whispers in nearly all of his works. For him, freedom isn't this light, uplifting ideal we often romanticize. It's heavy. It demands. It exposes, sometimes in brutal ways, who we really are inside. Think about Raskolnikov, a brilliant, intelligent young man consumed by one idea. What if some people are above ordinary morality? What if he could commit a crime, not out of cruelty, but as a way to test his own superiority? Driven by this theory, he kills, and then everything falls apart. The freedom that once seemed noble turns into torment. There's no liberation, only fever, guilt, delirium. His rational thinking melts in the face of a shattered conscience. Dostoevsky uses this character to show that freedom without responsibility is a trap. It's not enough to be able to choose. You have to understand the weight of your choice. Freedom without a deep moral sense is like handing dynamite to a child. It's dangerous, destructive, and isolating. Even more disturbing is the case of Ivan Karamazov, a man who commits no crime with his own hands, but his cold, skeptical, perfectly logical ideas are the spark that lights the tragedy. Ivan famously declares, "If God does not exist, then everything is permitted." He challenges the world to live with that kind of absolute freedom, but it tears him apart inside. He starts to lose his mind. He feels guilty for a murder he didn't commit, but one he helped plant in someone else's soul. The guilt here isn't legal. It's existential. Ivan doesn't need a courtroom to be condemned. His own conscience plays that role perfectly. And Dostoevsky makes us see that ideas carry weight, that the freedom to think, to speak, to act comes with a trail of responsibility that never really goes away. This dilemma runs through all of Dostoevsky's work. We have the right to choose, but we can't escape the consequences of those choices. And that goes for both good and evil. Freedom isn't just the ability to act. It's the strength to deal with what comes after. Can you see how relevant this is today? We live in a world where the idea of freedom is everywhere. Follow your heart. Do whatever you want. No one can tell you what to do. But Dostoevsky asks us to stop and think. What kind of freedom is that? The freedom to run away? The freedom to hurt others and then say, "That's my right"? The freedom to destroy your own soul and call it authenticity? No. For him, true freedom is quiet. It's internal. It's the kind that shows up when you face your hardest choices and can honestly say, "I chose this, and I accept what comes with it." In Notes from Underground, the narrator mocks logic, reason, and progress. He says something eerily true, that humans, even when they know what's best, will often choose the worst, just to prove they're free. There's something in us that refuses to be reduced to formulas. Something that wants to break the logic just to scream, "I'm human." That irrational, rebellious, even self-destructive freedom is part of who we are too. And Dostoevsky doesn't condemn it. He understands it. He shows that contradiction is part of the soul. That freedom isn't about making sense, it's about being whole. But that comes with a price: responsibility. It's not easy to accept that our choices shape who we become, that we can't always blame others, or society, or God, or fate, that sometimes we're the ones who failed because we made the wrong choice. And Dostoevsky never lets us off the hook. That's why his characters suffer so much, not just because of what happens to them, but because they know they could have chosen differently. Their freedom isn't heroic, it's human, it's fragile, it's real. This dilemma is also clear in the character of Dmitri Karamazov, another brother in the Brothers Karamazov. Dmitri is impulsive, driven by passion, capable of love and violence at the same time. He's accused of a crime he didn't commit, but deep down, he believes he deserves punishment, not for that crime, but for all the other wrongs he carries inside. That idea, that we can be guilty even if we escape justice, is one of Dostoevsky's most powerful insights. Human justice may fail, but the conscience never does. And yet, there's beauty in that, because if we're free to mess up, we're also free to start over, to repent, to forgive, to rebuild. That's the key Dostoevsky offers. Not to reject freedom, but to turn it into something greater. A freedom that's not selfish, but aware. That's not destructive, but transformative. A freedom that brings us closer to others, not farther away. Free will, for him, is more than a moral choice. It's a spiritual battle, a direct confrontation between ego and the sacred, between pride and redemption. And maybe that's why his stories are so intense. They're not about rules, they're about the soul, about what happens inside us when no one's watching. Dostoevsky doesn't want to comfort us. He wants to wake us up. He wants each of us to look inward and ask, I'm free, but what am I doing with that freedom? Have you ever made a choice that still haunts you? Said something, done something that echoes inside you even years later? If so, welcome to Dostoevsky's humanity, because there is no freedom without the weight of responsibility, but there's also no growth without that weight. So here's the question: what are you doing with your freedom? Not all suffering ends in despair, and Dostoevsky knew that better than most. Maybe it's because he faced darkness up close, a mock execution, years in a Siberian labor camp, constant seizures, poverty, and addiction. But unlike many of his contemporaries who looked to reason for a way out, Dostoevsky looked at pain and saw faith. Not an easy, dogmatic, or comfortable kind of faith, but one that's raw and hard-earned, stitched together through tears and hardship. In The Brothers Karamazov, the novel he considered his most important, this idea becomes central. Faith. There isn't just belief in God, it's resistance against hopelessness. Alyosha Karamazov, the youngest brother, is the picture of quiet, steady faith. He's a disciple of the elder Zosima, an Orthodox monk whose peaceful presence changes those around him. Alyosha doesn't try to prove God exists with arguments. He doesn't give speeches or debate. His faith shows up in actions, in kindness, in listening, in compassion. While his brothers Ivan and Dmitri are caught in deep existential and moral struggles, Alyosha represents the possibility of redemption through trust in the sacred. And what's striking is that his faith doesn't deny the pain of the world. It embraces it. It holds space for it. The Orthodox Christianity in Dostoevsky's work is deeply mystical and personal. It's not a set of moral rules. It's a path of inner transformation. The kind of faith he shows doesn't separate the human and the divine. It says, God is found in love between people, in forgiveness, in sacrifice, in humility. And that's exactly why, for Dostoevsky, faith is the only force powerful enough to save a person from total despair. Ivan Karamazov is the perfect contrast to this. He's brilliant, sharp, and deeply rational, and he cannot accept a world where innocent children suffer. He doesn't reject God out of pride. He does it out of compassion. He simply refuses to believe a just God would allow such pain. In one of the most intense scenes of the book, Ivan tells a story of a little girl being beaten by her parents. Then he asks his brother, if saving all of humanity meant accepting that child's suffering, would you accept it? Alyosha responds with silence and tears. And it's that silence that carries the power of faith. Because faith, to Dostoevsky, isn't an answer, it's a stance. It's choosing to believe even when nothing makes sense. It's choosing love when everything around you screams hate. It's trusting in mystery when reason runs out. This kind of faith shows up again and again in his characters. Take Sonia in Crime and Punishment, a young woman forced into prostitution to feed her family. She lives in poverty and shame, yet still carries a quiet light. She reads the gospel to Raskolnikov. She doesn't preach, she simply offers, and through her, Raskolnikov begins his path toward redemption. Dostoevsky's Christ isn't a distant judge. He's the crucified man, suffering with those who suffer. He kneels to wash the feet of sinners. He carries the weight of all, even those who reject him. Zosima, the elder in the Brothers Karamazov, says something powerful. Each of us is guilty for everything and for everyone. At first, that sounds unfair, but there's deep wisdom in it. The idea that human responsibility is shared, that salvation requires compassion, that it's not enough to save yourself, you have to carry others too, and that's only possible through faith. Not abstract faith, but lived faith. The kind that visits the sick, feeds the hungry, forgives the unforgivable. Dostoevsky shows that the greatest miracle isn't walking on water, it's loving in a world that teaches us to hate. That's why, even as nihilism grew in his time, he didn't give in. While philosophers like Nietzsche were declaring the death of God, Dostoevsky spoke of a living God, not as a theory, but as a presence, as a whisper in pain, as a forgiving gaze. He understood that modern people were spiritually sick, that we were starving for meaning, for connection, for transcendence. And in that world, faith wasn't a way to escape. It was a kind of medicine. But make no mistake, Dostoevsky's faith isn't magical. It doesn't erase suffering. It transforms it. It gives it meaning. It lets someone look at their pain and say, even here, God is with me. In the scene where Sonia reads the resurrection of Lazarus to Raskolnikov, there's a hidden message. Even someone who's already stinking, who seems completely lost, can come back to life. Even someone who's crossed every line can be restored. That's the essence of Dostoevsky's Christian faith. A faith that never gives up on anyone. A faith that believes in the impossible. And maybe that's what touches us the most. The idea that no matter how far we've fallen, we are never truly alone. That hopelessness isn't the end. That there's a force that lifts us up. Not because we earned it, but because we're loved. Have you ever gone through a moment where everything felt hopeless, and yet something inside you still believed things could work out? That something, for Dostoevsky, has a name, and that name is faith. In Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky isn't interested in judging. He wants to understand. The crime at the heart of the novel isn't just a legal offense, it's a spiritual wound. And guilt doesn't come from external punishment. It comes from the internal collapse of someone who has turned away from their own humanity. Rodion Raskolnikov doesn't just kill an old pawnbroker. He tries to kill a principle. He wants to prove that he can rise above common morality, that he can act like a great man, like Napoleon. In his theory, certain people are extraordinary and have the right to break the law if it's for a greater good. The murder, then, becomes an experiment, a test to see if he belongs to this higher class of men. But what happens right after the crime completely shatters the logic of his idea. He doesn't feel relief or power. What comes is fever, panic, hallucinations, sleeplessness. His body starts to break down. His mind begins to unravel. He loses the ability to live with others and with himself. Dostoevsky, with brilliant psychological insight, shows us that the real punishment doesn't come from the police or the courts or prison. It starts the moment Raskolnikov breaks from his own conscience. Guilt is the invisible character that follows him on every page. And it's not religious guilt, based on rules or doctrine. It's existential guilt. Raskolnikov feels that by committing the murder, he didn't just kill someone, he killed a part of himself. He believed he could be a new kind of man, above morality. But the experience proves the opposite. He is deeply human. And for Dostoevsky, being human means being capable of empathy, of conscience, of regret. So the crime isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a journey into self-awareness. In killing, Raskolnikov tries to deny his own fragility, only to discover it's still alive and stronger than ever. That's why this book isn't a detective novel. It's a deep dive into the soul, a detailed look at what happens to someone who breaks with moral meaning, not just in society, but in their own being. Dostoevsky takes us inside the mind of the criminal, and what we find isn't coldness or evil, it's conflict, fear, anger, and above all, a deep thirst for meaning. Raskolnikov isn't a villain. He's a lost man, a man who tried to become an idea and failed. This psychological complexity is one of the most brilliant parts of the novel. Dostoevsky writes almost prophetically, anticipating ideas Freud would explore decades later. He understands that people are full of contradictions, that they can justify the unjustifiable when desperate or feeling intellectually superior. But he also shows that this justification never satisfies the soul. The conscience doesn't follow logic. It's quiet but relentless. Even when no one knows about the crime, even when there's no proof, it's there, demanding, tearing away, punishing. The world around Raskolnikov reflects his inner state. The city of St. Petersburg is suffocating, full of narrow alleys, filthy streets, constant noise. There's a persistent fog, a sense of claustrophobia. The physical space mirrors a mind in torment. And then Sonia enters the story. Sonia is the opposite of everything Raskolnikov tries to be. She's fragile, yes, but she has integrity. She holds on to her faith. She lives in misery, but never lets go of her humanity. She sacrifices herself to support her family, humiliated by the world, and yet she carries a light that Raskolnikov has lost. And through her, he begins to see a path toward redemption. The real turning point doesn't come from outside, it comes from within. It's not prison that changes him. It's the encounter with love, with forgiveness, with compassion. When Sonia reads him the story of Lazarus's resurrection, Dostoevsky suggests something powerful. Even someone who is spiritually dead can come back to life. But that rebirth requires a descent into personal hell. It means facing guilt, not denying it, not rationalizing it, but accepting it as part of rebuilding the self. That's what makes crime and punishment so profound. The crime, in the end, is just the trigger. The real drama is in the soul trying to deal with the consequences. And the big question isn't what did he do? It's who did he become because of it? In today's world, where modern psychology often tries to explain everything through trauma, patterns, and brain chemistry, Dostoevsky reminds us that there's something more. That there's a moral, spiritual, deeply human layer that can't be reduced to formulas. The soul feels, and in feeling, it transforms. Have you ever done something, even small, that haunted you for days? Have you ever tried to justify something wrong only to realize deep down that no excuse brought peace? That's Raskolnikov's experience, taken to the extreme. He commits a crime to prove a theory, and learns the soul isn't a science experiment. Guilt isn't a flaw in the system. It's proof there's still something alive inside us. In the end, what crime and punishment offers is a journey, not one of punishment, but of awareness, not of hate, but of reconciliation. The crime is the break, guilt is the path, and redemption is a choice. Few characters in literature are as deeply human and as uncomfortable as the narrator of Notes from Underground. He has no name, no face, no traditional plot, but what he does have, in abundance, is awareness. A sharp, sick, contradictory, and painfully honest awareness. In this short two-part novel, Dostoevsky opens a wound and invites us to look inside. The underground man doesn't live in society. He hides. He speaks from a basement, a cave, a dark place, not just physically, but psychologically. From there, far from the world, he confesses. And in doing so, he tears apart the masks of modern man. I'm a sick man. I'm a spiteful man. That's how he begins. No filters, no attempt to look good. And throughout the book, he flips between bitter arrogance and deep self-pity. He's proud and ashamed, superior and miserable, intellectual and cowardly, all at once. What Dostoevsky shows through him is one of the key truths of human psychology, the internal battle between the desire to be seen and the fear of being exposed, between the pride of feeling unique and the shame of not being accepted. The underground man's pride is so intense that he'd rather suffer than submit. He even says that he takes pleasure in being humiliated because it reinforces his own narrative of wounded greatness. He doesn't want to be healed, he wants to be right, even if it means bleeding for it. He's the opposite of the traditional hero. He doesn't fight for anything, he doesn't win anything, and he inspires no one. But he thinks a lot, and that's where his abyss lies. Dostoevsky sets him up as a direct challenge to the rationalism of the time, especially Enlightenment ideas that claimed human beings are logical and predictable. The underground man mocks this. 2 + 2 = 4. But what if I want it to be 5? That line is a scream for freedom. Irrational, destructive freedom, but still deeply human. He wants to show that people are not machines, that there's something inside us that resists formulas, that chooses the wrong path just to prove we're alive. And that's why, even though he's pathetic, he also feels very real. He hates others, but craves love. He mocks people who live with purpose, but secretly envies their simplicity. He tries to convince the reader that he's above the mediocrity of everyday life, but everything he says is soaked in loneliness, resentment, and inner pain. Maybe the most revealing moment of his fragility comes when he tries to connect with Liza, a young prostitute. He humiliates her with harsh words, trying to assert his superiority. But right after, he breaks down in tears. He begs for affection, and when she offers it, when she reaches out, he pushes her away again. Not because he doesn't want it, but because he's ashamed. He doesn't know how to handle love when it finally shows up. That cycle, wanting, hating, moving close, pulling away, is the mark of emotional self-destruction. The underground man ruins everything he touches, because deep down, he doesn't believe he deserves to be saved. And even worse, he's afraid of losing control over his pain, the one thing that still makes him feel real. That's the silent tragedy of many people. Pain becomes identity. Loneliness turns into a shelter. Resentment becomes a shield. And the deeper they sink into it, the harder it is to climb out. Because getting out would mean changing. And change requires letting go of pride, something the underground man simply cannot do. Dostoevsky doesn't judge him. He exposes him. He shows us that we all have a little underground inside us, some wounded, hidden part, a part that sometimes ruins our relationships, that makes us reject help, mistrust joy, choose familiar pain over unfamiliar peace. That's why this book makes people uncomfortable. Not because the character is sick, but because he's too real. He says things we've thought but never said. He feels what many try to hide. And because of that, even though he's hard to like, he's necessary. He's a mirror. And what we see is that pride, when fueled by shame, becomes a prison. A trap where the mind builds excuses for everything, but the heart still can't breathe. The underground man is smart, but miserable, sharp, but stuck. He sees everything, except a way out. And maybe the cruelest truth is this: he doesn't want a way out, because pride won't let him admit he needs to change. In the end, he disappears. He stays in the underground. And the reader is left with the question, how many of us are still down there too, hiding under layers of irony, sarcasm, criticism, fear, and loneliness? Dostoevsky invites us to face that part of ourselves, to see that pride and shame walk side by side. That self-destruction isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, made of small daily rejections of love, change, and hope. But he also leaves us a warning. You don't have to stay underground. The first step out is simple: humility, the courage to say, I don't have it all figured out. I'm struggling. I need help. And maybe that's the only real way out, to go down, not to hide, but to finally find yourself. Inside each of us, there's a battlefield. Good and evil aren't just out there in society or split between different characters in a story. They're inside us, mixed together, constantly at war. And maybe no one in literature portrayed this inner struggle as boldly as Dostoevsky did. To him, human beings are not simple. We're not purely good or completely corrupt. We're a messy mix of light and darkness, love and hate, selflessness and selfishness. And that complexity isn't a flaw in nature. It's what makes us deeply human. In the brothers Karamazov, this duality lives in the brothers themselves. Ivan stands for reason, skepticism, cold logic. Alyosha represents faith, quiet love, surrender. Dmitri is raw desire and uncontrollable passion, but none of them are fully good or fully evil. Ivan, despite his sharp mind, is haunted by moral doubt. Alyosha, the gentle monk, has moments of rebellion. Dmitri, for all his chaos, is capable of tenderness and remorse. Dostoevsky crafted them this way on purpose. He wanted to show us that the fight between good and evil isn't about fixed character. It's about constant choice. No one is free from temptation. No one is doomed to damnation. We're all unfinished. And that's exactly where hope lives. In Crime and Punishment, this battle is even more intense. Raskolnikov commits a murder, believing he's above ordinary morality, but afterward, his conscience begins to fall apart. He swings between philosophical justifications and waves of guilt, between pride and despair, between isolation and the longing for redemption. Good and evil don't show up as abstract ideas. They speak from within his mind. At times, he feels justified in killing. At others, he sees himself as the worst kind of man. That back and forth shows us something powerful. Doing evil doesn't erase the good inside us, and wanting to do good doesn't undo the harm we've caused. Both forces coexist. They clash. They push against each other. And that may be one of Dostoevsky's greatest gifts. He doesn't moralize. He doesn't oversimplify. He understands that the real battle between light and shadow happens in the quiet of the soul, far from the eyes of the world. It's an invisible war, but a fierce one. One of the most striking examples of this inner tension is the character Smerdyakov, also from the brothers Karamazov. He's cynical, bitter, manipulative. But he's also fragile, insecure, and completely lost. It's easy to label him a villain, but Dostoevsky makes us see that even the darkest souls have cracks where the light tries to get in. Or at least tries to. Dostoevsky believed no one is evil by nature. He said evil comes from pain, shame, and being excluded. And that good shows up when we choose, despite everything, to love. Not out of obligation, but from a kind of spiritual clarity. This idea is deeply rooted in the Orthodox Christian tradition, which doesn't divide the world into pure and sinful, but sees all people as capable of redemption. For Dostoevsky, sin isn't the end. It's the starting point for transformation. That's why his characters, no matter how broken they are never thrown away. Yes, they fall, but there's always a chance to rise again, even if it hurts, even if it takes time, even if the battle never fully ends. Notes from Underground takes this duality even deeper. The narrator lives torn between the pride of thinking he's better than the world and the pain of feeling like he belongs nowhere. He enjoys hurting others and feels guilty afterward. He wants to be loved, but ruins every chance of getting close. He moves between cruelty and sensitivity, cynicism and despair. And what's most unsettling is that he knows it. He's fully aware of his contradiction. And that awareness is what destroys him. Because the more he understands himself, the more he realizes he's trapped by something he can't control, his divided heart. The idea that evil can live even in the most self-aware, and that good can rise even in the darkest souls, is one of Dostoevsky's most powerful contributions to moral philosophy. He was ahead of his time, anticipating what psychologists like Carl Jung would later call the shadow, the hidden part of our personality that must be faced if we want to grow. Ignoring the evil within is dangerous, because what we don't accept in ourselves, we project onto others. What we refuse to face turns into judgment, hatred, and violence. Dostoevsky invites the reader to do something hard, but necessary, to look inside and admit that yes, evil is there, but so is good. And real maturity isn't about eliminating one side. It's about learning to deal with both. Have you ever caught yourself doing something you'd harshly judge in someone else? Have you ever found yourself justifying actions that, coming from another person, you wouldn't forgive? That's the duality Dostoevsky shows us. And it's both frightening and freeing, because it stops us from pointing fingers, but it also reminds us we can change. Good isn't something we inherit. It's something we choose, and evil, no matter how present it feels, doesn't have to get the final word. In the end, Dostoevsky doesn't want us to be perfect. He wants us to be aware, to recognize the struggle, to stop pretending we're something we're not, to have the courage to face the shadow, and maybe, just maybe, turn it into light. The idea that human beings can be reduced to an equation, predictable, measurable, programmable, was to Dostoevsky one of the greatest threats to the human soul. Much of his work was dedicated to fighting exactly that, the attempt to reduce human life to a rational and utilitarian system. In 19th century Europe, belief in scientific progress was at its peak. The Enlightenment had promised a new era of reason and order. Science seemed able to explain everything, and people began to see humans as part of a larger system, one governed by natural laws that could be discovered, organized, and applied to human behavior. If physics could explain the world with laws, why not do the same with morality, society, and even the soul? That's where philosophies like utilitarianism came in, claiming that the best action is the one that creates the greatest good for the greatest number. Morality became a calculation. Happiness became statistics. The common good could be measured in units of pleasure and pain. But for Dostoevsky, this was offensive. It was a mutilation of the human soul. His most direct attack on this mindset shows up in Notes from Underground, a short and unsettling work that begins with a jab. I'm a sick man. I'm a spiteful man. The narrator there is someone who rejects everything systematic. He mocks Enlightenment ideals, laughs at the idea of a world built on logic, and most of all, challenges the belief that people will always choose what is rational or beneficial. To him, even if we knew all the laws of the universe, even if math could prove what's best for each person, humans would still choose the opposite. Maybe even because it's the opposite. Why? Because, he says, people want the right to choose, even if the choice destroys them. 2 + 2 is 4, but what if I want it to be 5? That line sounds ridiculous at first, but it's actually a cry of rebellion. It says there's something in us that goes beyond logic, that wants the freedom to mess up, that would rather live in chaos than in control, rather deal with uncertainty than surrender. Dostoevsky deeply distrusted the so-called engineers of the soul, those who believed they could shape a perfect society through formulas and systems. The utopians, social scientists, idealist revolutionaries who dreamed of creating a new man. All of them, in his eyes, ignored one crucial truth. Humans are unpredictable, contradictory, and most importantly, free. That freedom, though, is seen by rationalists as a problem. If people are truly free, they can't be perfectly managed, and if they can't be controlled, they threaten the system. So there's this desire to erase subjectivity, tame instincts, and silence the soul. In Demons, also known as The Possessed, Dostoevsky digs even deeper into this critique. The novel tells the story of a group of revolutionaries trying to overthrow the current order and build a new society, one based on reason, science, and total control. They dream of a utopia where everything is calculated, even morality, where free will is abolished in the name of efficiency. But at the heart of that dream is something terrifying. For utopia to exist, freedom has to die. The unpredictable must be erased. The soul must be annihilated. And what comes out of that? Emptiness, violence, madness. Dostoevsky saw that obsessive rationalism didn't liberate people. It enslaved them. It turned human beings into machines. And to him, that was worse than suffering. The mystery of human existence lies not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for. That line, from the brothers Karamazov, sums up his rejection of the utilitarian view of life. Living for pleasure, for efficiency, for statistics, that's not enough. Humans need meaning, mystery, something transcendent, and none of that fits into a formula. To Dostoevsky, rationalism was dangerous because it offered security, but at the cost of the soul. He understood that a society that trades the sacred for usefulness, mystery for method, and freedom for order might work on the surface, but it rots from the inside. He also criticized utilitarian thinking through characters like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov tries to justify murder with an idea: kill one useless person to benefit many. Sounds logical, sounds rational, but the result is destruction, guilt, and inner collapse. Because the human soul isn't a math problem, it's an abyss. Raskolnikov learns the hard way that life can't be organized like an equation, that no matter how sophisticated an idea sounds, it can't replace a conscience. And that evil, even when justified, is still evil. Dostoevsky wasn't against science. He saw its value. What he opposed was reductionism, the idea that everything can be explained by reason. He believed humans aren't just brains. We're also hearts, instincts, faith, pain, and memory. And any worldview that leaves that out is bound to fail. That's why he defended faith, not as blind belief, but as openness to mystery, as a way of recognizing that there are things we don't understand, and maybe never will. And that's exactly where the sacred lies. Dostoevsky urges us to be wary of people who promise perfect systems, who claim to have all the answers, who try to erase uncertainty. Because in the end, we live in uncertainty. And it's from that place that freedom is born, and love too. So, the question is, do we still have the courage to live outside the equation? There's a truth that runs through Dostoevsky's work like a thread of hope in the middle of chaos. No matter how far someone has fallen, love can still reach them. Not romantic or idealized love, but real, painful, flesh and blood love. A kind of love that embraces the sinner, forgives the unforgivable, and turns despair into faith. For Dostoevsky, it's not punishment that redeems, it's mercy. This idea was almost revolutionary in the 19th century Russian literary world, which was full of political struggles, ideological clashes, and dark portraits of the human condition. While many writers searched for salvation through reason, revolution, or art, Dostoevsky turned to the Gospels and found there a truth no theory could compete with: only love can heal the soul. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov is a young man, intellectually brilliant, but spiritually lost. He commits murder, believing he's doing something useful for the world. But soon after, he's crushed by guilt, feverish, alienated, trapped in a psychological maze with no way out. That's when Sonia enters the story. A young woman forced into prostitution, living in misery, yet somehow full of light. She doesn't judge, doesn't preach, doesn't condemn. She simply loves. Sonia is the one who offers Raskolnikov the gospel, who listens without asking for explanations, who chooses to stand by him, not because he deserves it, but because she sees something in him that he himself no longer sees, the possibility of redemption. And that's what begins to change him. Not logic, not law, but mercy. That act of love marks the start of his transformation. It doesn't happen overnight. Raskolnikov still resists, still tries to justify his actions, still hides behind pride. But something shifts inside. A seed is planted, and over time, it breaks through his hardened ego and begins to grow. He confesses. He goes to prison. He suffers. But in that suffering, he finally starts to find himself again. Dostoevsky makes one thing clear. Salvation doesn't come through force, not through intelligence, not through punishment. It's born in a broken heart that dares to accept love, even in its misery. This same truth is explored even more deeply in the brothers Karamazov, especially through the character of Elder Zosima, the wise monk who represents living spiritual wisdom. Zosima teaches that we are all responsible for one another, that forgiveness is the path to freedom, that judging others is often just a way to avoid facing our own faults, and that only love can restore what's been broken. Alyosha, Zosima's disciple, lives this message. He's surrounded by a world full of violence, hatred, pride, and power games. But he chooses to respond with kindness, with gentleness, with a quiet faith that doesn't try to convert anyone. It simply stays present. For Dostoevsky, love isn't a feeling, it's a decision, a sacrifice, something that shows up not in pretty words, but in real actions, in showing up when someone falls, in offering forgiveness when everything in you wants revenge. This kind of mercy doesn't mean being naive or passive. On the contrary, it takes real strength. It requires letting go of pride. It takes humility to admit we're all flawed, that we all need forgiveness. In The Idiot, Prince Mishkin is perhaps the clearest example of this love. He's called an idiot because he loves too much, trusts too much, forgives too much. In a cynical world where everyone hides behind masks, he shows up as someone pure, and because of that, he's mocked. But Dostoevsky pushes us to ask, who's really the fool? The one who loves without fear, or the ones who live in mistrust, competition, and self-destruction? Mishkin shows us that mercy has a cost. He suffers, he's betrayed, he loses everything, but he never hardens. And that unwavering commitment to love, even in pain, is what makes him, paradoxically, the most clear-sighted of them all. Dostoevsky doesn't romanticize this love. He knows it hurts. That forgiveness means dying to the ego, that opening your heart is a risk. But he also knows that without it, there's no real life. Only survival, and that's not enough. He saw modern society drifting toward coldness, toward quick judgment, toward losing empathy. And his answer was radical. Forgive. Even the ones who don't deserve it. Love. Even the ones who hurt you. This love doesn't come from us alone. It's divine in origin. But it shows up in human ways. In a look, a touch, a quiet presence. It's the kind of love that kneels, that asks for nothing in return. That simply gives. Have you ever been forgiven when you didn't expect it? Ever been loved even when you didn't feel worthy? Had someone stay by your side even after knowing your deepest flaws? That's the essence of redemption for Dostoevsky. Not some big miracle, just a gesture, a look, a hug, a quiet "I understand" that shows up when everything else seems lost. That's why, despite all the darkness in his books, they're never hopeless. Because at the heart of every shattered soul, he sees a spark, a place where love can still enter, where mercy can still make a home. And maybe that's his greatest message. No matter how broken someone is, they're still worthy of love, still capable of being forgiven, still able to start again. Dostoevsky believed this with everything he had, not as a theory, but as a lived truth. He himself had been marked by failure, addiction, prison, and he knew what it meant to start over by grace. That's why he could write about it with such power. In the end, he leaves us with a challenge. What kind of world do we want to build? A world where only the strong, the perfect, and the winners have a place? Or a world where love has the final word? The answer is in our hands. What happens to a person when they stop believing, not just in God, but in any higher purpose, any ultimate truth, any absolute value? Dostoevsky explored this question like few others. And his answer didn't come through theories, it came through characters standing on the edge of the abyss. At the heart of Dostoevsky's work is a fear of a world that abandons God, not just as a religious figure or a myth, but as the spiritual foundation of human life. One of his most famous lines comes from the brothers Karamazov, where the character Ivan says, "If God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted." This isn't just a dramatic quote, it's a warning. Ivan doesn't say it to shock. He says it as someone who sees a deep wound. If there's no God, no higher good, no purpose that gives meaning to suffering, no presence that justifies love, forgiveness, or compassion, then what stops us from falling into cruelty, into total indifference, into selfishness without limits? Dostoevsky was one of the first to sense the rise of nihilism, the belief that life has no purpose, that values are just social constructs, and that in the end, everything leads to nothing. 19th century Russia was going through a spiritual crisis, and Dostoevsky felt that modern disbelief wasn't just killing God, it was drying up the soul. In Demons, this crisis becomes political. The young revolutionaries in the novel believe God is holding back progress. They think they can build a new morality without anything divine. But the more they try to replace God, the deeper they fall into despair, paranoia, and violence. Their dream of utopia turns into a nightmare because it's built on emptiness. For Dostoevsky, nihilism isn't a neutral idea. It eats away at everything. Once you reject a higher good, everything becomes relative. Everything becomes useful or disposable. And soon, human life loses its value. Other people become obstacles, tools, statistics. And before long, killing is no longer a moral crime. It becomes a logical choice. That's exactly what happens with Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. He doesn't kill out of hatred. He kills based on an idea, a theory that says some people are above common morality. That's what happens when someone tries to build meaning without God. It leads to collapse. What sounded rational becomes unbearable, because the soul, even when it denies, still feels. Dostoevsky understood that nihilism doesn't lead to freedom. It leads to despair, to a loss of identity, to a broken conscience. When everything is permitted, nothing truly matters anymore. Not even life itself. And that's exactly what Ivan Karamazov goes through. One of Dostoevsky's most complex characters, Ivan is smart, deep, and obsessed with justice. But he can't reconcile faith with the suffering in the world. He doesn't reject God out of pride. He does it out of compassion. And that's what breaks him. He collapses. He has visions. He speaks with the devil. His reason, without a spiritual core, starts to fall apart. Dostoevsky wasn't saying reason is bad. The danger comes when reason cuts itself off from the soul, when it tries to live without anything higher, without humility, without mystery. And that, he believed, was the real threat of modern life. Still, he never gave us easy answers. He didn't say, "Just believe, and everything will be fine." His characters who do have faith, like Alyosha or Sonia, also suffer, also doubt, also fall. But they carry something different, a quiet fire inside, a sense of meaning that doesn't come from circumstances, but from connection to something greater. For Dostoevsky, faith isn't the opposite of reason. It's the opposite of emptiness. It's the courage to believe when there's no visible reason to. It's love that keeps going, even when surrounded by hate. It's forgiveness that rises from guilt. It's the sacred that still whispers, even after everything is lost. In his novels, the world without God is still possible, but it's spiritually dead. There might be technological progress, political structure, even social justice, but something is missing. The why, the deeper meaning that holds everything together when everything falls apart. That's why Dostoevsky always spoke in the language of the soul. He wrote about sin, repentance, and redemption, not as religious rules, but as universal human experiences. He showed that without a higher moral anchor, even the most beautiful virtues become fragile. Goodness without deep roots turns into convenience, and evil, when rationalized, spreads like a quiet epidemic. The absence of God, then, isn't just a theological issue. It's an existential one. It's the question that remains after all the answers collapse. Why keep going? If everything is random, if love is just a chemical reaction, if pain has no meaning and death is the absolute end, why get out of bed? Why forgive anyone? Why love at all? Dostoevsky didn't argue against nihilism with philosophy. He did it through stories. He showed us what happens when people lose their faith. He made us feel the pain of emptiness. He let us witness the breakdown of those who tried to live without God and couldn't. But he also showed that it's never too late to come back, that even the most wounded, most skeptical, most broken can still find meaning. Not an easy meaning, not a pre-packaged faith, but one that's built through suffering, a belief born in the middle of chaos, a presence that reveals itself in the silence. And maybe that's his boldest message. Humans need God, not because we're weak, but because we're too deep to live in a void. Few passages in literature are as provocative, deep, and unsettling as the parable of the Grand Inquisitor, found at the heart of the brothers Karamazov. Written by Ivan Karamazov and told to his brother Alyosha, the story is a powerful theological, political, and existential allegory that explores one of the most painful tensions of human life, the choice between freedom and comfort. In this parable, Jesus returns to earth, not in the future, but in 16th century Seville, right in the middle of the Spanish Inquisition. He arrives silently, heals the sick, brings people back to life, and is immediately recognized by the crowd, but then arrested by the church. That same night, the Grand Inquisitor, an old, cold, and powerful cardinal, visits Jesus in his prison cell. Jesus remains silent, and the Inquisitor, in one of the most intense monologues in all of literature, explains why he had Jesus arrested. Jesus is a threat to the order of the world. The Inquisitor, with chilling clarity, claims that Jesus made a mistake by giving humans freedom, that by refusing to turn stones into bread, refusing to throw himself from the temple for angels to save him, and refusing Satan's offer to rule over the kingdoms of the world, Jesus asked too much of humanity. According to him, people don't actually want freedom. They want bread. They want safety. They want someone to tell them what to do. That's why, the Inquisitor says, the church stepped in to correct Jesus' mistake. It took over as the authority, the provider, the external moral compass. It relieved people of the burden of choice and gave them certainty, rules, and easy salvation in exchange for their freedom. Dostoevsky's criticism here isn't just aimed at the Catholic Church or the Inquisition. It's much broader. He's calling out any system, religious, political, or ideological, that uses human fear to control, oppress, and treat people like children. any structure that promises paradise in return for blind obedience, any doctrine that prefers loyal followers to free individuals. The Grand Inquisitor represents the dark side of organized religion, the side that trades love for power, living faith for dead doctrine, and spiritual freedom for the comfort of dogma. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Dostoevsky wasn't against faith. He was a passionate defender of human freedom within faith. For him, God is love because he allows us to choose. He doesn't force us to believe, and he doesn't save us by force. In Dostoevsky's view, Christ even respects our right to reject him. And that's exactly what the Inquisitor cannot accept. He says plainly that he sided with Satan because Satan understood human nature better than Christ. Satan offered what people truly want: bread, miracles, and authority. In other words, survival, spectacle, and submission. In this way, Dostoevsky anticipates the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, the false promises of utopia, and the psychology of the masses. He shows how people, when faced with fear and hunger, often give up their freedom in exchange for security. And there's always someone ready to take advantage of that. According to the Inquisitor, freedom is a burden people aren't equipped to carry. It brings anxiety, doubt, guilt. That's why, he says, most people would rather be slaves with full bellies than free and hungry. But Dostoevsky gives us a response, not through words, but through Christ's silence. Jesus doesn't argue. He doesn't defend himself. He simply listens. And before leaving, he walks up to the old Inquisitor and kisses him on the lips. That simple, radical gesture tears down everything the Inquisitor just said. In it, we see the full truth of who Christ is: forgiveness, freedom, unconditional love. The kiss is his silent answer. It shows us that power can arrest, judge, and punish, but it can't reach the heart. It can't crush the soul's freedom. And it can never destroy love. The Inquisitor trembles, but he doesn't change. He tells Christ to leave and never come back, because if he returns, everything that's been built in his name, but without his spirit, will fall apart. This scene is a powerful and painful critique of how God's name can be used to justify everything he actually stood against. Dostoevsky isn't just making a theological point, he's raising a deep human question. What do you truly want? Freedom or security? Love or control? Living faith or dead doctrine? The Grand Inquisitor forces us to look inward. How often do we follow orders instead of thinking for ourselves? How often do we trade conscience for convenience? How often do we give up our freedom just to avoid the pain of doubt? And maybe the hardest question of all, how often do we use God's name to justify controlling others? Dostoevsky believed freedom is sacred. Without it, there can be no true faith, because you can only love God if that love is a choice, not a command. You can only be saved if you accept salvation freely, not out of fear. And even though freedom can hurt, even though it demands responsibility and leaves us exposed, he believed in it with all his heart. The parable ends, but the question stays with us. Are you ready to be free? 2 + 2 = 4. But what if I want it to be 5? With this line, the narrator of Notes from Underground gives voice to one of Dostoevsky's most provocative and profound ideas, rejecting pure logic as a way to affirm human freedom. In a world increasingly ruled by reason, science, and predictable systems, Dostoevsky stood as a dissenting voice. He wasn't against reason, but he believed that when logic becomes a kind of tyranny, it turns into a prison, cold, impersonal, and inhuman. To him, a human being isn't a rational machine. We're made of flesh, memory, impulses, contradictions, and faith. Trying to reduce the human soul to formulas, systems, or mathematical predictions is a kind of spiritual violence. In Notes from Underground, the main character, a bitter, isolated, sick man, rebels against everything systematic. He mocks ideas of progress, promises of engineered happiness, and theories that claim people will always choose what's rational. He challenges all of it with painful conviction. Humans are irrational, and that's exactly why we're free. Irrationality here isn't madness. It's the ability to resist determinism, to say no even when yes would be the more logical choice. It's choosing not to follow the script, just to prove we still have will. This underground cry is a defense of human subjectivity against the cold machinery of utilitarian logic. With sharp clarity, Dostoevsky saw what many 20th century thinkers would later confirm. The obsession with control, prediction, and organization leads to dehumanization. By insisting that irrationality is essential to being human, Dostoevsky was saying something very simple and very radical. We are not just functions, we are mysteries, and within mystery lies freedom. Imagine a world where everything is predictable. Every action has one outcome. Human behavior can be calculated like a computer program. In that world, freedom disappears, because everything would already be decided. That's why Dostoevsky believed people must be allowed to choose even what harms them. We must have the right to make mistakes, to contradict ourselves, to rebel against what's rational, not out of ignorance, but out of pride, passion, and soul. This vision directly challenges the Enlightenment and utilitarian ideals of the 19th century. For many rationalists of that time, reason was the path to liberation. If everyone acted rationally, the world would become better, fairer, and more efficient. But Dostoevsky saw a trap in that, because if irrationality is seen as a disease, then everything spontaneous, emotional, or spiritual gets treated as a flaw, and people start living in fear of themselves. He warns us, when a society decides that logic is the only valid way to live, it begins to eliminate anything that doesn't fit. Feelings are seen as weakness, faith as illusion, art as a distraction, love as just a chemical imbalance. And little by little, what's lost isn't just the soul, it's freedom itself. Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, tries to justify murder through reason. He believes that by killing a useless old moneylender, he'll be helping society. It's a utilitarian, logical, almost scientific idea. But what happens after the crime is what Dostoevsky wanted to show. Logic can't carry the weight of conscience. The soul doesn't follow formulas, and guilt, that irrational, deeply human force, invades everything. Dostoevsky believed that true freedom begins where logic ends, when someone, despite all evidence, still chooses love, when they forgive what can't be forgiven, when they believe without proof, when they suffer and still refuse to cause harm. That's why irrationality, to him, wasn't a flaw. It was resistance, a cry, a reminder that we are not machines. This idea might sound dangerous, and it is, because it opens the door to mistakes, chaos, and pain. But Dostoevsky never promised an easy path. He knew freedom is risky, that to be free often means destroying what's safe. But he also knew that without that risk, there's no dignity. The kind of irrationality he defends isn't destruction for the sake of it. It's the sacred space of choice. It's what keeps us from being tamed, from being predictable, from being just another cog in the system. To the world, the person who loves without guarantee, who suffers out of compassion, who believes in the invisible, who chooses the harder path, that person might look foolish. But to Dostoevsky, they are the freest of all, because they chose. And only those who choose are truly human. Have you ever done something that made no sense, but felt right? Have you ever followed your heart even when your mind screamed no? Have you ever forgiven when everything inside you wanted revenge? Those moments, no matter how small, are proof of the soul's irrational freedom. They're the cracks in logic where light gets in. Dostoevsky didn't want to destroy reason. He wanted to free it from tyranny. He wanted to remind us that reason is a tool, not a god. And maybe his greatest message is this: don't be afraid to contradict yourself. Don't be afraid to not make sense. Don't be afraid to be deeply, absurdly human. In Dostoevsky's world, no one suffers in silence. Pain, especially moral pain, transforms people. It becomes the driving force behind action, rebellion, despair, or redemption. But there's a specific kind of pain he explores with obsessive attention: humiliation. What interested him most wasn't just the act of being humiliated, but what that experience awakens deep inside the human soul. How can shame turn into pride? How can feelings of inferiority give rise to violence? How can the pain of feeling small become a near-compulsive need to dominate? To Dostoevsky, the humiliated person doesn't necessarily seek justice. They seek compensation. They want to flip the scale, often not with kindness, but with cruelty. And that's where pride and the will to power emerge, as instinctive responses to a wound that refuses to heal. In Notes from Underground, the narrator is one of the most brutal portraits of this mechanism. He's a bitter, lonely, resentful man who obsesses over the smallest humiliations from his past. He doesn't just remember the offenses, he feeds them. He chews on every detail of his pain, and instead of healing, he turns his pain into identity. The underground man's pride is defensive. He'd rather suffer than submit. He'd rather sabotage everything than risk rejection. He looks down on others, but only because he's terrified of being looked down upon. And it's this open wound that drives him to act destructively toward others and himself. Dostoevsky reveals a hard truth. The more someone feels inferior, the more dangerous their pride can become. This pattern repeats in many of his characters. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov carries a quiet rage against the world. He feels humiliated by poverty, by his social impotence, by the mediocrity of daily life. So he lashes out with a gesture of power. He kills someone. For him, the murder is a way to prove his superiority. A desperate cry that says, "I'm not like the others. I can do this." But the aftermath tells another story. Guilt eats him alive. His conscience disarms him. The power he longed for turns out to be hollow. Dostoevsky shows that pride born from humiliation doesn't liberate, it enslaves. It's a pride that's fragile, inflated, insecure, and it only stands if someone else is beneath it. And that's what makes the will to power in his characters so tragic. It doesn't come from greatness, but from pain. The desire to dominate, to humiliate, or to assert control is often just a desperate attempt to silence the echo of an old wound. In The Brothers Karamazov, this dynamic intensifies. Dmitri, the most impulsive of the brothers, constantly swings between extremes. He feels wronged, betrayed, disrespected, and responds with explosive pride. He yells, threatens, lashes out. But behind that mask is a man who simply wants to be loved. A man who, wounded since childhood, became a prisoner of his own temper. Ivan, on the other hand, takes a different path. Intellectual pride. He refuses to forgive God for the suffering of the world. His rebellion against the pain of innocent children sounds noble, but it hides a quiet vanity, the need to be right, the refusal to bow before mystery, and that pride, that unwillingness to surrender, leads him toward madness. Then there's Smerdyakov, the darkest of the brothers, who represents the most extreme case of humiliation turning into destruction. Raised as a servant, always treated as inferior, he absorbs that contempt and turns it into silent hatred. He doesn't explode like Dmitri. He waits, he calculates, and at the right moment, he kills. His violence isn't impulsive. It's cold, rational, built on years of unacknowledged humiliation. And that's what makes him so disturbing. He's the embodiment of a wound that no one ever saw. A wound that grew in the dark, that turned into poison. Dostoevsky forces us to face this dark corner of the soul. Pride as defense, violence as the language of the unheard, power as compensation for trauma. And he helps us see that behind many acts of aggression lies a pain that never had the chance to heal. But he also shows us another way. Characters like Sonia, Alyosha, and Father Zosima take a different path. They suffer too. They're humiliated too. But they choose to respond with humility, with compassion, with faith. And that choice isn't weakness, it's strength, because it breaks the cycle. Choosing not to respond to humiliation with pride is an act of courage. Choosing love in a world that teaches us to hurt, that's heroic. And Dostoevsky believed this was the true spiritual victory. In his work, redemption doesn't come from gaining power. It comes from giving up pride, from forgiveness, from embracing your own vulnerability. He knew it wasn't easy. The urge to respond with violence is strong. The need to prove your worth through pain is nearly irresistible. But he also knew that if the cycle isn't broken, it destroys us from the inside. Have you ever felt humiliated and responded with pride? Ever wanted to hurt someone just so you wouldn't look weak? Ever built walls around yourself when all you really wanted was to be seen? If so, you understand what Dostoevsky was trying to show us. That unhealed pain becomes a defense. That pride is often just a cry for someone to notice us. That power can be a mask for fear. And that deep down, we all want one thing: to be loved, even after we've fallen. Living means carrying questions that may never have answers. Why are we here? What's the point of pain? How do we move forward when everything feels directionless? These questions have haunted the human soul forever. But in Dostoevsky's work, they take on flesh, voice, and anguish. That's why he's considered one of the key forerunners of existentialism, a philosophical movement focused on the tension between human beings and the absurdity of existence. To Dostoevsky, life is a spiritual battle, not between religions, ideologies, or political systems, but between faith and emptiness, love and nihilism, meaning and despair. He lived in a time when God was being slowly pushed out of the cultural and philosophical conversation, and he saw clearly the emotional and moral consequences of that shift. At the heart of his view is the human being faced with freedom, and freedom, when it isn't grounded in a greater purpose, can become a crushing burden. That's what Albert Camus would later call the absurd, the tension between our deep need for meaning and the silent, indifferent universe. According to Camus, there is no ultimate logic, no final answer, and yet, we keep searching, we keep living. And that, he says, is where the greatness of humanity begins. Dostoevsky, though more rooted in faith, starts from the same place. The world hurts. Life is confusing. Suffering feels unfair. God often seems absent, but what makes his characters unique is how they respond to this. Ivan Karamazov, for instance, rejects God, not out of shallow skepticism, but out of deep compassion. He refuses to accept a world where innocent children are tortured. He can't forgive a reality that seems built on injustice. His rebellion is honest and deeply painful. Camus saw Ivan as an existential figure, someone who refuses cheap answers when faced with the absurd, someone who chooses honest silence over comforting lies, and that's essential. Both Camus and Dostoevsky believed that human dignity lies in not surrendering to the absurd, but standing up to it. Søren Kierkegaard, another giant of existential thought, saw the confrontation with absurdity as the starting point of faith. He didn't deny anguish, he called it the dizziness of freedom. But he believed that by making a leap, the individual could turn despair into transcendence. Not logical transcendence, but a personal surrender, a trust in the invisible. A deeply intimate relationship with God that doesn't rely on proof, but on courage. Dostoevsky walks that same path. His characters live immersed in doubt, but they're not destroyed by it. In fact, it's in the chaos that they get closer to the truth. Faith, in his world, isn't the absence of anguish, it's commitment despite the anguish. Raskolnikov, for example, tries to give life meaning through a rational idea that an extraordinary man has the right to kill for the greater good. But once he commits the crime, he realizes logic can't sustain the soul. Guilt, pain, isolation, all of it reveals that human beings are more than reason. Something deeper cries out for meaning, and that cry slowly leads him to humility repentance, and faith. In The Idiot, Prince Mishkin is another example of resistance to the absurd. He lives in a corrupt, cynical, violent world and still chooses to love, to forgive, to be pure. People mock him for it. The idiot, after all, is the one who refuses to play the game, who won't meet cruelty with more cruelty. But that refusal is exactly what makes him free. And that's Dostoevsky's point. Humans don't overcome the absurd through strength, but through love, through choice, through staying faithful to what's good, even when everything around them is falling apart. The difference between Dostoevsky, Camus, and Kierkegaard lies in their endings. Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, says it's possible to live without appeal, that even if there's no ultimate meaning, we can create our own. There's dignity in continuing to push the boulder uphill, knowing it'll roll back down. To live is to rebel, to resist. Kierkegaard, on the other hand, finds the answer to despair in the leap of faith. For him, it's not enough to struggle with absurdity. We must trust in the eternal, in a personal relationship with God, in inner salvation. Dostoevsky stands between the two. He acknowledges the absurd, feels its weight, portrays its effects, but doesn't accept it as the final word. He believes there is a light, that faith, lived, suffered, embodied, can restore. That love is stronger than nihilism. That compassion is the real revolution. But he doesn't get there through cheap optimism. He walks us through the desert of doubt. He makes us wander through the void so we can learn to value presence. For him, faith is only real when it has already passed through the fire of unbelief. Have you ever felt like nothing made sense? Like life was just a cycle without meaning, and all you could do was keep going, without knowing why? Dostoevsky knew that feeling. Camus did too. Kierkegaard lived it deeply, and each of them, in their own way, gave the same answer: keep going. Not because there's a promise waiting, but because there's dignity in the search. Because the freedom to ask is already a kind of miracle. Because resisting, loving, having faith, even without guarantees, is what makes us truly human. In the end, the search for meaning in the absurdity of life isn't about finding one final answer. It's about how you choose to live in the face of no answers. And there, Dostoevsky smiles, not with mockery, but with tenderness, and quietly whispers, "It's in the darkness that light proves itself." Forgiving is a simple act, and almost impossible, because it's not just about forgetting what was done to you. It's something deeper, more radical, more transformative. It's looking at the one who hurt you and saying, "I don't reduce you to what you did to me." Dostoevsky understood this with chilling clarity. In a world marked by violence, pride, and a thirst for justice, he proposed something even harder: forgiveness as an inner revolution, as spiritual freedom, as moral rebuilding. In his works, forgiveness is never a weak gesture. On the contrary, it's a display of deep inner strength, because it requires breaking the cycle. It requires letting go of the right to strike back. And that's not weakness, it's soul-level maturity. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov believes he can live above morality. He commits murder based on a rational theory, that killing a useless old pawnbroker could free him from misery and help humanity. But after the crime, he finds no relief, only torment. Raskolnikov's redemption doesn't come through formal punishment, but through intimate forgiveness. And that forgiveness begins with Sonia, a poor, humiliated young prostitute, yet spiritually unshakable. She doesn't judge, she doesn't punish, she just stays, loves, listens, forgives. She reads him the gospel, cries with him, walks beside him, even knowing his sin. And it's this merciful presence that slowly begins to break Raskolnikov's pride. Little by little, he understands that he can only begin again when he accepts forgiveness. and, more importantly, when he forgives himself. That's the core. For Dostoevsky, forgiveness isn't just between two people. It's an internal process, a reconciliation with one's own conscience, and that takes real courage. Shame paralyzes, pride defends, but forgiveness creates space for something new, transcendence, the possibility of not being defined by your worst moments, of starting over, of rebuilding what seemed lost. Dostoevsky shows this again in the brothers Karamazov, especially through the monk Zosima. He teaches that forgiveness is inseparable from love, that judging is always easier, condemning feels comfortable, but forgiving, that requires a higher spirit. Zosima says that we're all responsible for everyone, that no one is isolated in guilt, that the evil in others is also our responsibility. And for that reason, the only real way forward is mutual forgiveness, sincere repentance, humility. This teaching is lived out through Alyosha, the youngest brother, who carries a quiet faith and a love that expects nothing in return. Alyosha is insulted, mocked, tested, and responds with compassion, not out of weakness, but out of choice. And that choice, in Dostoevsky's view, is the true sign of freedom, because forgiveness is a decision, not a reaction. It's the soul freeing itself from the pain caused by someone else, and that's where forgiveness connects to love. Not idealized romantic love, but mature love, the kind that sees the wounds and stays anyway. The kind that doesn't expect perfection, but turns imperfection into a space for growth. Dostoevsky understood that true moral transformation doesn't come from punishment. It comes when someone is met with forgiveness and is then forced to look in the mirror with honesty. Mercy at times is more powerful than justice because it dismantles pride and reveals the soul. In The Idiot, Prince Mishkin is called a fool for forgiving too much, for not fighting back, for loving even those who betray him, and yet he's the most clear-sighted character in the story because he understands that those who hurt others are often hurting themselves, that those who destroy are often crying out for healing. Mishkin forgives not because he's naive, but because he's wise. And Dostoevsky makes it clear, the world may never understand this kind of strength, but it's the only strength powerful enough to break the cycle of pain. There's a powerful scene in The Brothers Karamazov where Alyosha, after hearing confessions of guilt and witnessing deep family conflict, kneels before his brother Dmitri, the most impulsive, the most violent, and embraces him. It's a gesture without words, but filled with meaning, an embrace that holds forgiveness, that says, "You're not alone." For Dostoevsky, it's moments like these that keep humanity from falling apart, because the world is full of reasons to hate, to judge, to break ties. But it's in forgiveness that the chance to start again is born, the chance to give back, to others and to ourselves, the dignity we thought was gone. Have you ever been forgiven for something you thought was unforgivable? Have you ever had the chance to forgive someone who caused you deep pain? And how did it feel afterward? Moments like these stay with us because they touch something essential. The hope that we are more than our worst mistakes. That life can go on. Different, yes, but still full of meaning. Dostoevsky doesn't offer an easy world. His characters are flawed, conflicted, tormented. But he insists, with everything he's got, that love and forgiveness are still possible. That even at rock bottom, there's a ladder. And climbing that ladder doesn't take perfection. It takes humility. Forgiveness to him is that ladder. It's the turning point. It's the seed of peace. And maybe in the end, this is what we most need to remember. Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering and still choosing to love. Time moves fast. Death gets closer. And what comes after? For Dostoevsky, these aren't abstract questions. They're existential obsessions. The experience of being finite, the fear of death, and the search for eternity run through his work like an invisible thread, always present, even when the theme isn't directly addressed. His characters live under the shadow of death, but not as something far away. For them, death is close, personal, urgent. It's not just a biological end, it's a direct confrontation with the meaning of existence. Dostoevsky knew this because he faced it himself. At 28, he was sentenced to death for political involvement. Standing before a firing squad, he believed for several minutes that he was going to die. At the very last moment, the execution was called off. That experience changed him forever. He felt time freeze. He looked death in the eye, and he survived. After that, everything changed. The awareness of death became a constant whisper in his writing, and with it came the question, how do we live, knowing that everything ends? In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan, the skeptical intellectual brother, faces death with bitterness. He can't accept the world's suffering, let alone the idea of an eternal life that justifies it. For him, if there's no justice now, there's no justice anywhere. Eternity becomes an empty promise. Ivan tries to live only in time, in the here and now. But his soul can't handle that limit. He breaks down. Because Dostoevsky believed that humans weren't made to live only within time. Alyosha, the faithful younger brother, sees death differently. When his mentor, the elder Zosima, dies, Alyosha grieves. But through that pain, he discovers the spiritual side of life. He realizes that death isn't absence, it's transformation. That love continues, that someone's presence can feel even more alive after the body is gone. Alyosha represents faith in the unseen, hope in eternity. For Dostoevsky, eternity isn't just a religious dogma. It's a need of the soul. He saw time as a kind of prison. Not because time is cruel, but because human beings are bigger than time. We thirst for something lasting, for something that remains, for something that gives meaning to what time constantly takes away. That tension between time and eternity appears strongly in The Idiot. Prince Mishkin, deeply sensitive to the world's pain, lives with an almost constant awareness of death. He sees everything as fragile. He watches people get lost in petty fights, pointless arguments, forgetting that life could end at any moment. Mishkin doesn't judge. He loves. He forgives. Because he knows time is too short for pride. And in the face of death, only love matters. In Crime and Punishment, death also hovers like a constant threat. Raskolnikov lives in a feverish state of guilt and existential dread. He tries to justify his crime with logic, but his soul screams. His fear of death isn't just fear of being caught, it's fear that nothing has meaning. That his life was wasted in a moment that can't be undone. He experiences moral death before physical death. And his only salvation begins when he starts to imagine a life beyond time. A spiritual life. For Dostoevsky, death is the mirror of truth. It shows what truly matters. It cuts through distractions. It forces us to look inward. His characters who face death, literally or symbolically, are the ones who come closest to the truth. In his work, eternity isn't just life after death. It's a spiritual dimension that begins here. It's what endures when everything else falls apart. It's loyalty to goodness, even when there's no immediate reward. It's love that survives time. But this view isn't comforting. Dostoevsky doesn't offer easy answers. He shows that the awareness of death can lead either to despair or to faith. It can harden the soul or purify it. It all depends on how we face that presence. Dostoevsky himself said that in the face of death, we can choose between nihilism and hope. Nihilism says, nothing matters, everything ends. Hope says, everything ends. But maybe that's just the beginning. And he believed in that second option, not because he was naive, but because he knew pain, because he had felt death approaching for real, and because even in that final moment, he discovered that something inside him still beat strong. something that didn't just want to survive. It wanted to live with meaning. That's why, in his stories, death is never the end. It's the turning point. The moment that shows who we really are. The moment the soul is laid bare. Have you ever felt time passing clearly? Have you ever realized life is short, and that made you rethink your priorities? Have you ever lost someone, and through that grief discovered the value of life's small moments? Those are the moments Dostoevsky invites us to live with more clarity. Not with fear of death, but with respect for life. Because deep down, he believed time wasn't given to us to become perfect, but to learn how to love. And that death, far from being the enemy, is the reminder that we must live with more presence, more awareness, more courage. Eternity, then, is not a place. It's a choice. It's how we treat others. It's the good we do when no one is watching. It's holding our tongue when we want to hurt. It's offering forgiveness when pride wants to shout. And through his characters, Dostoevsky whispers, "Life is short, but love is eternal." Few writers have had the courage to dive as deep into the human soul as Dostoevsky, and in no other author does the idea of sin appear so paradoxically, not as condemnation, but as a starting point for compassion. For him, guilt is universal, and acknowledging that doesn't separate us from others. On the contrary, it's what connects us. The idea that everyone is guilty runs through his works like an invisible thread, linking victims and aggressors, the innocent and the guilty, saints and sinners. The most iconic phrase in this sense appears in The Brothers Karamazov, spoken by Elder Zosima. Each of us is guilty of everything, and for everyone. At first, that sounds unfair. How can someone be guilty of everything and for everyone? How can we be responsible for someone else's suffering, the world's mistakes, or the failures of others? But Zosima and Dostoevsky aren't talking about guilt in a legal sense. They're talking about the moral interconnectedness of humanity. The deep idea that what I do, think, or fail to do affects the world around me. That indifference is also a kind of sin, and that recognizing your own fall is the first step toward forgiving the fall of others. This idea shows up in many of his characters. Dmitry Karamazov, for example, is impulsive, jealous, out of control. He accuses his father, fights with his brother, lies, cheats. But in the end, when he's wrongly accused of murder, he doesn't explode in rage like we'd expect. Instead, he says, "I'm guilty of another crime." Even though he didn't commit that crime, he owns up to his past. He accepts the suffering as a kind of purification. That's the spiritual movement Dostoevsky cares about. Confession, not as humiliation, but as liberation. For him, guilt isn't a weight that drags us down. It's a mirror. And in that mirror, for the first time, a person sees themselves honestly. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov tries to escape guilt. He rationalizes the murder he committed. He argues that it was for the greater good, a useless old woman gone, and humanity helped. But what destroys him isn't the police, it's his conscience. Guilt starts eating him from the inside, and no intellectual argument can quiet that voice. But that's exactly where his redemption begins. When he finally admits his guilt, when he stops running, when he accepts his brokenness, that's when he becomes human again. And what saves him is Sonia's forgiveness, a sinner in the eyes of society, but deeply compassionate. She also carries her own guilt, and that's why she can understand someone else's pain. And this is one of the most powerful parts of Dostoevsky's vision. Only someone who recognizes their own guilt can truly forgive. Only someone who knows they're flawed can embrace others without judgment. So sin, then, isn't the end, it's the beginning. Awareness of our own darkness is what makes room for light. And as strange as it sounds, Dostoevsky tells us, it's through the recognition of evil that the path to good begins. This idea echoes Orthodox Christian thinking, which is deeply woven into his work. In the Orthodox tradition, sin isn't just the breaking of rules. It's a kind of spiritual illness, a break in the soul, and repentance isn't punishment, it's healing. What makes Dostoevsky's take unique is how radical it is. He doesn't put sin only in the obvious criminals, the murderers and the wicked. He puts it in everyone, in small actions, in hidden thoughts, in coldness, in pride, in the lack of compassion. In Notes from Underground, the main character doesn't commit crimes, but he lives in a constant state of self-destruction. He puts others down because he feels low. He despises because he feels despised. Deep down, he's full of wounded pride that keeps him from loving. He's drowning in sin, not because he kills, but because he refuses to love. For Dostoevsky, the greatest sin is pride, believing you don't need anyone, thinking you're better, more righteous, cleaner. Pride keeps people from repenting. It blocks forgiveness. It locks us in ourselves. That's why admitting we're sinners is an act of humility, and even more, an act of freedom. Because only those who admit guilt can choose to change, can open their hearts, can love for real. Have you ever had a moment when you looked at yourself honestly and said, "I messed up"? Have you felt that mix of pain and relief when you finally admitted a mistake you were trying to hide, even from yourself? Those moments, uncomfortable as they are doors. Doors to others, to God, to real life. Because there's no true relationship where there's a mask of perfection. Compassion, says Dostoevsky, comes from knowing we've all fallen, that we all struggle with something, that there are no perfect saints, only people trying, stumbling, starting again. That's why, in his view, the real danger isn't the sinner who repents. It's the righteous person who thinks they're untouchable. That kind of person doesn't see, doesn't feel, doesn't listen, doesn't forgive. So sin, far from being just condemnation, is, in Dostoevsky, the fertile ground where compassion grows, where empathy begins, where true human connection is born. And maybe that's his biggest message. Don't hide your guilt. Don't pretend to be perfect, because it's in the moment you accept your fall that the possibility of rising begins. In Dostoevsky's work, the child is far more than a secondary character. The child represents a spiritual mystery, a symbol of purity and tragedy woven together. Through children, Dostoevsky projects his vision of humanity, divine, yet fragile, innocent, yet marked by suffering. Childhood in his stories is never romanticized as a time of naive happiness. It's where the sacred is revealed, and because of that, where injustice becomes unbearable. The child represents the purest part of human nature, and for that very reason, their pain carries an almost unbearable weight. In The Brothers Karamazov, the character Ivan Karamazov shares one of the most disturbing passages in Western literature. He recounts, in heartbreaking detail, real stories of children being brutally mistreated by adults, parents, landowners, military men. Ivan uses these stories to challenge his brother Alyosha's faith and to question the very idea of a just God. It's not about God, I'm just respectfully returning my ticket to this universe. I don't want to accept a world where children are tortured, even if it guarantees eternal harmony. That moment is a moral outcry. Ivan isn't debating theology. He's saying, the suffering of an innocent child is unjustifiable. No promise of future paradise can erase that pain. And Dostoevsky, despite his deep faith, doesn't offer an easy answer. He lets the question hang. He takes it seriously. He makes it the heart of the story. Why does a child's suffering strike us so deeply? Because the child is a symbol of what hasn't yet been corrupted. A child doesn't carry guilt, doesn't hold malice. And that's what makes their pain feel so absurd, so unacceptable. And that's exactly the space Dostoevsky dares to explore. He doesn't avoid the theme. He returns to it again and again. In Crime and Punishment, for example, the little girl Polenka, Sonia's daughter, lives in poverty and misery. She's quiet but unforgettable. Raskolnikov sees her, sick, fragile, hungry, and it cuts into him. She stands in complete contrast to his cold theories about crime and power. She represents a humanity he can't ignore. And even without saying a word, Polenka forces him to confront the unanswerable. How do we justify the existence of evil when innocent children suffer? In The Idiot, the image of the child reappears, this time as a symbol of kindness and empathy. Prince Mishkin, the so-called idiot, is often compared to a child. His innocence, his ability to forgive, and his lack of malice make others see him as foolish. But that foolishness is actually a form of spiritual depth. He sees people without judgment, like a child sees the world, with openness, with vulnerability. So the child isn't just a victim. The child is a mirror, a reminder to adults of what they've lost, of what humanity used to be, and what it could still become. But Dostoevsky never idealizes childhood. He knows children can suffer deeply, can be cruel, can carry invisible wounds. The tragedy of childhood isn't just in the pain inflicted. It's in being misunderstood, neglected, or emotionally abandoned in a world that doesn't listen. One of the most moving scenes is the death of little Ilyusha, the son of an alcoholic soldier, also in the brothers Karamazov. The boy is dying, surrounded by his friends. They don't know what to say, but they stay by his side. In this scene, filled with pain and tenderness, Dostoevsky reveals childhood as something sacred, in the truest sense of the word, something that demands we kneel before the fragility of another human being. Because in the end, a child reminds us of something essential. Life is vulnerable. Love is risky. And another person's pain matters deeply. Dostoevsky doesn't write about children to make us feel pity. He writes about them because he sees in childhood the key to understanding the human soul. Like Christ himself, Dostoevsky believed we must become like children, not in ignorance, but in moral purity, spiritual openness, and the ability to feel real compassion. In a world ruled by cruelty, power, and domination, the child is the one who hasn't yet learned to hurt others to survive. And for that reason, they're the ones who suffer most. But they're also the ones who have the most to teach us. Have you ever been moved by a small gesture from a child? A look, a question, a spontaneous hug? Moments like that, as brief as they are, awaken something that time often hardens. Sensitivity, empathy, the awareness that there's still beauty in the world, even in the middle of chaos. Dostoevsky writes to remind us of this, to say that yes, the world is tragic, evil is real, injustice screams, but even so, in the middle of the pain, there is still beauty, and that beauty often wears the face of a child. In the end, childhood, in Dostoevsky's work, is the unfulfilled promise of humanity. It's what we could have been, but somehow lost. It's what we can recover, not through naivete, but through love, through compassion, through the courage to return to what really matters. Because, as Dostoevsky suggests, maybe the true test of any civilization is how it treats its children, and maybe the true path to redemption begins, unavoidably, with the recovery of lost innocence. For Dostoevsky, faith isn't some abstract idea or a way to escape the world. It's a calling, direct, demanding, and deeply rooted in moral responsibility toward others. True spirituality, in his view, doesn't happen in the isolated soul reaching for God in the heavens, but in real human encounters, often with people who are flawed, suffering, and difficult to love. This idea is expressed powerfully in the brothers Karamazov, especially through the character Alyosha, disciple of the elder Zosima. Zosima teaches Alyosha that love for God is only real when it turns into active love for others. Loving God only with words, empty prayers, or mystical feelings disconnected from everyday life is an illusion, and even a form of spiritual pride. Love man, even in his sin, says the elder, because that love mirrors divine love. Dostoevsky is ruthless with idealized love. In one famous passage, he writes that people are capable of loving humanity in the abstract, but can't stand their actual neighbor, the brother, the stranger, the one who's messy, needy, and hard to deal with. Real love for him only exists when it becomes action, when it requires sacrifice, patience, and humility. That's why the most spiritually rich characters in his work are the quiet ones who take care of others without recognition. Sonia in Crime and Punishment, for example, is a young woman forced into prostitution to support her family. Society sees her as impure, but in Dostoevsky's world, she embodies one of the purest forms of love and faith. She doesn't preach. She doesn't judge. She stays. She loves Raskolnikov even in his guilt, even in his arrogance. And that steady, quiet love is what slowly transforms him. To Dostoevsky, true Christianity is rooted more in compassion than in rigid morality. It's not about labeling people good or bad. It's about seeing others through eyes of mercy. Love for God, then, can't be separated from real life. It shows up, or doesn't, in how we treat the most vulnerable. Loving others takes more than words. It takes presence. It's easy to love humanity from a distance. It's hard to love the person right in front of you, with their flaws, bad habits, and all. Dostoevsky understood this deeply. He gives us a simple spiritual test. Want to know how much you love God? Look at how well you love the person right in front of you. And this kind of love isn't blind sentimentality. It's not soft indulgence. It's commitment. It's responsibility. It's what philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who was influenced by this tradition, called being awake to the need of the other. And in Dostoevsky, that alertness is the deepest form of prayer. In The Idiot, Prince Mishkin embodies this ideal. People think he's naive, but his naivety is actually radical faith. He sees people not just as they are, but as they could be. He sees something divine even in those lost in darkness. And because of that, he doesn't give up on them. The love he gives is raw, vulnerable, often misunderstood, but it's real, and it transforms lives. Dostoevsky seems to tell us that the experience of God begins right there, in the vulnerability of love that takes risks. God isn't just in the heavens, he's in acts of compassion, in the hard work of forgiveness, in listening, in healing. This spirituality isn't comfortable. It demands constant conversion. Saying, I believe isn't enough. You have to live it. And that often means stepping back. Forgiving when everything inside you wants revenge. Embracing when your instinct is to walk away. Staying when leaving would be easier. Have you ever had someone love you when you felt undeserving? Ever felt the power of someone being there for you without asking for explanations, just saying, I'm here? For Dostoevsky, those moments are encounters with the sacred, because that's how God loves, without conditions. But this kind of love comes with a cost. It offers no guarantees. Loving others means opening yourself to pain, disappointment, rejection. It means walking forward without certainty and still choosing to love, because real love, as Zosima says, is a harsh and dreadful thing. Not cruel, but demanding. It's radical surrender. And maybe that's exactly what makes faith real. The fact that it isn't proven in words, but in choices. Loving others isn't some cold moral duty. It's communion. It's the language God uses to reach the world. With deep compassion and existential insight, Dostoevsky challenges us to reconnect what modern life has pulled apart. Faith and action, spirituality and ethics, heaven and earth. He reminds us that true mysticism lives in the everyday, that the sacred reveals itself in how we care for others, that loving God can't be separated from how gently we treat the people around us. And if there's something revolutionary in Dostoevsky's Christianity, it's this. The path to God runs through open hands, shared tears, and the effort to see the other not as a burden, but as a brother. In the end, Dostoevsky leaves us with a quiet, uncomfortable question. What is your faith really worth? if it doesn't show up as real love for the person beside you. For Dostoevsky, the human mind is a battlefield where reason and madness, faith and doubt, love and despair collide with overwhelming force. But what stands out in his work isn't just the portrayal of psychological conflict. It's the boldness with which he dives into the depths of madness, not to diagnose it, but to listen. Instead of treating insanity as a mere illness, Dostoevsky sees it as a brutal revelation. Often, it's in the collapse of reason that his characters access hidden truths. Truths once buried under cold logic and the masks of social morality. Madness for him isn't the end of consciousness. It's a journey through a space where the deepest parts of the human soul come to the surface. In The Idiot, Prince Mishkin is called an idiot because of his innocence and purity. To the world, he seems insane. He talks too much, trusts strangers, doesn't respond with aggression, and misses social cues. But behind this so-called foolishness is a deep spiritual vision. Mishkin sees beauty even in those everyone else has condemned. And ironically, it's because of this goodness that he is crushed by a world that sees his clarity as madness. What is a man without madness? Dostoevsky asks, a haunting, existential question that forces us to rethink what we mean by sanity. After all, what does it mean to be sane in a sick world? In Dostoevsky's stories, madness becomes the soul's protest against the artificial structures of reason, against systems that distance us from mystery, real suffering, and true compassion. In his world, to go mad isn't just to lose touch with reality. It's to tear away the mask of convention and see life exposed, raw and unfiltered. Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, commits murder, believing he's following a higher logic, a cold, Napoleonic idea that some men are above common morality. But as guilt devours him, he falls into a state of mental chaos. Fever, delirium, hallucinations. Justice doesn't come from human law. It rises from within, from a psyche crumbling under a deeper truth. He didn't kill for greatness, but out of pride and despair. Raskolnikov's journey isn't just about a man in conflict with society. It's about someone trying to suppress his own humanity for the sake of an abstract idea. And in doing so, losing himself. His madness becomes, paradoxically, the road to redemption. Because in madness, he strips off the masks. Because in madness, he reconnects with compassion through Sonia, a woman scorned by society, but who embodies unconditional love. Dostoevsky doesn't write about madness like an outsider. He lived with epileptic seizures, periods of depression, and intense visions. He knew, more than most, that the mind is fragile, and that sometimes, in our weakest moments, we are our truest selves. In his work, clarity isn't always a sign of health. Sometimes, it's just the mask of a dead soul. In Notes from Underground, the narrator is a bitter, isolated man tormented by his own intelligence. He thinks too much, feels too much, contradicts himself constantly. He knows he's sick, but also senses that his illness gives him a kind of clarity that normal people will never have. He's the voice of a broken inner world, but an honest one. His madness is a rejection of modern rationalism and its cold hypocrisies. Reason, in Dostoevsky's view, can be cold, limited, and arrogant. It can justify cruelty, erase mystery, mock faith. But madness, even in pain, can be fertile ground for spiritual awakening. It's no coincidence that many of his characters experience mystical moments during episodes of madness, visions of Christ, flashes of eternity, moments of divine clarity. We see this powerfully in the brothers Karamazov. Ivan, the atheist intellectual, suffers a mental breakdown after writing and reciting the Grand Inquisitor parable. He's haunted by a demonic hallucination, a smooth-talking, ironic devil who speaks to him in surreal, unsettling scenes. But this figure isn't just a product of Ivan's broken mind. It's the embodiment of his deepest moral contradictions. It's as if reason, pushed to its limit, open the gates of inner hell. Which leads us to a bold but unavoidable conclusion. In Dostoevsky's world, madness is a language of the soul, a strange, disturbing language, but a real one. It says what rational speech often hides: unresolved pain, hidden guilt, contradictory desires, a hunger for God. In a world afraid of the irrational, Dostoevsky dares to say that wisdom may live in the chaos. Have you ever felt out of place for feeling too much? Had thoughts you couldn't explain, but that seemed to show you something important? Dostoevsky writes for you, for all of us who at some point have questioned the rules and listened to voices the world calls madness. But that may actually be echoes of a deeper truth. Of course, he doesn't romanticize mental illness. His character's suffering is real, profound, often tragic. But he invites us to look beyond the illness, to ask, what is this pain trying to say? What truth lies buried in the breakdown? What divine spark survives the collapse? In the end, Dostoevsky invites us to reconcile reason and madness, logic and mystery. He wants us to see that the human mind is too vast to be boxed into formulas, that sometimes you have to go mad to see clearly, that some truths only reveal themselves at the edge. And maybe, at that edge, where all our certainties fall apart, the soul finally begins to speak. In every page he wrote, Dostoevsky seems to be searching for something that can't be easily grasped. He's not after easy answers or comforting theories. What he's looking for, with almost religious intensity, is the deepest core of the human being. What pulses beneath social masks, beneath dogmas, beneath reason. He's searching for the mystery of the soul. And what is the soul, if not that wild territory where good and evil, love and hate, faith and despair all live together in constant tension? Unlike many writers of his time, Dostoevsky wasn't interested in simply describing behavior. He wanted to go beneath the surface, to dive deep. His characters aren't moral caricatures or spokespeople for ideologies. They're living labyrinths. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov isn't just a guilty murderer. He's the embodiment of a soul torn between pride and guilt, between a sense of superiority and a desperate need for forgiveness. You can't explain him with a formula, because Dostoevsky knows the soul doesn't fit into formulas. That's why his writing often feels more like philosophy or theology than fiction, because he doesn't write to entertain, he writes to illuminate, or better, to show us that some parts of the soul can only be seen in the dark. Some things are only revealed when everything falls apart. In The Brothers Karamazov, each character represents a different side of the human soul. Ivan is reason clashing with God. Alyosha is faith searching for humility. Dmitri is wild desire craving redemption. Their father, Fyodor, is pure moral corruption. And in all of them, there's pain, searching, and doubt. Because Dostoevsky doesn't believe in flat souls. He believes in abysses. And what's most unsettling is that he doesn't offer a map through those abysses. He throws us into them. He invites us to feel what it's like to face the mystery. The soul, to him, isn't something to study. It's a battlefield. It's where God and the devil fight their quiet war. It's where we, as human beings, must choose, moment by moment, who we're going to be. This vision didn't come from imagination alone. Dostoevsky had seen darkness from the inside. He was arrested, sentenced to death, and pardoned at the last minute. He spent years in a Siberian labor camp. He lived surrounded by pain, misery, and hopelessness. And it was there, among criminals and exiles, that he began to understand something vital. Even the most broken soul still carries a spark of the sacred. In his work, no one is beyond saving. Even the cruelest, the most shattered, the most sinful, all of them have the potential for transformation. And that potential doesn't come from outside. It comes from within. Because Dostoevsky believed that the human soul is, above all, free. And it's that freedom that makes it so mysterious, so dangerous, so sacred. There is nothing more unbearable for a man than freedom, says the Grand Inquisitor, in one of the most powerful passages in all of literature. And maybe he's right. A truly free soul is terrifying, because it takes away our excuses. It forces us to choose, to love, to suffer, with no guarantees. It forces us to look in the mirror. But in that gaze, truth is born. And that's what Dostoevsky wants, for us to look, to see the shadow inside ourselves, not to be destroyed by it, but to become whole. Because only someone who knows their own darkness can choose the light with full awareness. That's the beauty and the terror of his vision. There's no safe space in the soul. There's conflict, there's contradiction, and most of all, there's responsibility. You can't just blame the world, or society, or fate. Good and evil are inside us, and we're the ones who decide, every step of the way, which one will follow. In The Idiot, Prince Mishkin may be the clearest picture of what Dostoevsky saw as a pure soul. He loves without judgment. He forgives without conditions. He suffers but never hates. And for all this, he's seen as insane. Because the world doesn't know what to do with real goodness. And yet, it's in this seemingly weak figure that the greatest spiritual strength lives. Because the soul, when filled with compassion, is unstoppable, even if it gets crushed by the world. This tension between the soul's beauty and its fragility is in everything Dostoevsky wrote. He knew we are full of contradictions, that we can pray and hate at the same time, that we can love and betray, that we can reach for God with one hand while pushing him away with the other. And still, he believes. He believes the soul is a mystery worth exploring, with tears, with courage, with faith. Have you ever felt like there's something inside you even you don't fully understand? An emptiness, a pull, a nameless guilt? Ever felt like you were in a battle with yourself? Dostoevsky writes for that place, for that part of the soul that's a whisper, a cry, a prayer. He writes to remind us that we are more than appearances, more than roles, more than ideas. We are depth, and maybe that's why his work still matters. Because in a world that wants to reduce us to data, labels, and diagnoses, Dostoevsky still looks us in the eye and asks, who are you when no one's watching? And more than that, do you have the courage to find out? It's not easy to enter Dostoevsky's world. His stories make us uncomfortable, shake us, touch something deep inside. But that's exactly why we need them. Because we live in a time that fears mystery, and in doing so, drifts away from the soul. But the soul doesn't go away. It waits. It waits for someone brave enough to listen, to accept it fully, to recognize that we are made of light and shadow, and only by embracing that truth can we begin to truly live. Dostoevsky gives us more than literature. He gives us a mirror and an invitation. The mirror, his work. The invitation, dive in. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the deep and unsettling universe of Dostoevsky. Few authors have dared to explore the depths of the human soul like he did. And maybe that's why his words still resonate so powerfully, even centuries later. If this content sparked something in you, whether it made you reflect, feel uncomfortable, or simply see yourself in a new light, then don't leave in silence. Like the video. It really helps the channel reach more people. Share it with someone you know needs to hear these ideas. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you can keep reflecting with us on philosophy, existence, spirituality, and everything that truly makes us human. Let me know in the comments, which of these reflections resonated with you the most? Which Dostoevsky character do you relate to the most? And don't close this video just yet. There's a lot more content here on the channel, all made with care, depth, and heart. Stick around. Keep exploring. See you in the next video. Until then.